In the autumn of 213 BCE, beneath the scorching Sicilian sun, Roman engineers laughed at the impossible walls of Syracuse, until one man's forbidden design made the gods themselves tremble. This is the story of how a single siege tower, born from obsession and defiance, brought the jewel of Magna Graecia to its knees and changed the art of war forever. Syracuse, Sicily, October 213 BCE. The Mediterranean wind carried the scent of salt and decay across the harbor of Syracuse, as Marcus Claudius Marcellus stood atop his command galley, surveying what many called the most impregnable fortress in the known world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the limestone cliffs that rose like the shoulders of sleeping titans from the azure waters, their surfaces scarred by decades of Carthaginian raids, and now, for 2 grueling years, marked by the futile attempts of Roman siege engines. From his vantage point, Marcellus could see the massive walls of Ortygia, the island citadel that formed Syracuse's heart. These weren't ordinary fortifications. They were the creation of Dionysius the Elder, built when Rome was still a collection of mud huts on 7 hills, 30 feet thick at their base, rising nearly 60 feet toward the heavens, constructed from blocks of stone so massive that 10 men could barely move one. The morning light revealed the scorch marks where Roman catapults had hurled their projectiles for months, leaving barely a dent in the ancient masonry. But it wasn't just the walls that made Syracuse unconquerable. It was the man behind them, Archimedes. Even speaking the name sent ripples of unease through Roman ranks. The greatest mathematician of the age had turned his brilliant mind from pure geometry to the brutal mathematics of warfare. His war machines had already sent dozens of Roman ships to the bottom of the harbor. The Iron Hand, a massive crane that could lift entire galleys from the water and dash them against the rocks. Burning mirrors that focused the sun's rays into beams of fire, igniting sails and flesh with equal efficiency. Artillery pieces that could hurl stones with such precision that Roman officers had taken to wearing helmets even in their own camps. For 26 months, Rome's finest legions had thrown themselves against these defenses. 26 months of watching good men die for mere yards of blood-soaked stone. Marcellus had tried every conventional approach: naval assault, direct siege, even attempted to starve the city into submission. Each attempt had been met with innovations that seemed to mock the very concept of Roman military superiority. The consul's weathered hands gripped the ship's rail as he studied the problem that had consumed his thoughts and haunted his dreams. Syracuse wasn't just a city. It was a mathematical fortress, defended by a mind that could calculate the trajectory of death itself. Traditional siege towers had been burned by mirrors. Scaling ladders had been grasped by mechanical claws and flung back with their human cargo still clinging to the rungs. Even the famous Roman testudo formations had been shattered by precisely aimed stones that fell like the fists of angry gods. Behind Marcellus, his engineers and centurions maintained the respectful silence of men who had run out of conventional solutions. They had tried everything in the Roman military manual and everything had failed. The mood in the camp had grown as dark as the storm clouds gathering over Mount Etna in the distance. Whispers of cursed ground and divine protection for Syracuse had begun to spread through the ranks like a plague more dangerous than any sword. But on this particular morning, as autumn began to paint the Sicilian landscape in shades of gold and crimson, a different kind of conversation was taking place in the command tent, a conversation that would change not just the fate of Syracuse, but the very nature of siege warfare itself. Lucius Gaius Duilius, chief military engineer of the Roman forces, stood before a table covered with scrolls, wooden models, and the accumulated frustration of 2 years' worth of failed attempts. Unlike his colleagues, Duilius didn't look defeated. His eyes held the dangerous gleam of a man who had spent sleepless nights wrestling with an impossible problem and had finally found an answer that terrified even himself. "Consul," Duilius began, his voice carrying the weight of certainty, "I believe I have found a way through those walls." Marcellus turned from his contemplation of the fortress, his expression mixing hope with the hard-learned skepticism of a commander who had heard too many promises of easy victory. "Show me." Duilius unveiled a model that made every man in the tent fall silent. It was a siege tower, but unlike anything Roman engineering had ever conceived. Where traditional towers rose perhaps 40 feet, this monstrosity stretched nearly 80 feet into the air, higher than the walls of Syracuse themselves. Its base was broader than a temple, reinforced with iron bands and bronze plates. Multiple levels bristled with catapults, ballistae, and platforms for hundreds of soldiers. "This is madness," whispered Gaius Scribonius, the camp's senior centurion. "The weight alone would make it impossible to move, and the wood required. We'd need to strip half the forests of Sicily." But Marcellus was studying the design with the intensity of a man seeing salvation. "Explain the mechanics, Duilius." The engineer's finger traced the intricate framework. "The secret lies in the counterweight system, Consul. Instead of relying purely on human power to push this tower, we create a series of internal mechanisms, pulleys, winches, and weighted pendulums that distribute the load. The tower essentially moves itself forward through controlled falling weights and leverage. It's based on principles I observed in some of Archimedes' own defensive machines." The tent fell silent except for the distant sound of waves against the harbor rocks. Every man present understood the implications. They were proposing to out-engineer the greatest engineer of the age, using his own principles against him. If you're fascinated by ancient engineering marvels and epic military campaigns, hit that like button, subscribe to dive deeper into history's greatest battles, and comment below telling us where in the world you're watching this legendary siege unfold. The weight of silence in the command tent pressed down like the oppressive heat of a Sicilian afternoon. Outside, the sounds of a massive military camp continued. The rhythmic hammering of smiths repairing weapons, the shouted orders of drill sergeants, the creak of siege engines being repositioned for yet another futile attempt. But inside this canvas sanctuary, 6 of Rome's most experienced military minds grappled with a proposal that could either secure their place in history or destroy them all. Marcus Claudius Marcellus traced his finger along the wooden model's towering frame, calculating not just engineering possibilities but political survival. This wasn't merely about conquering Syracuse anymore. The stakes had grown far beyond the walls of a single Sicilian city, no matter how strategically vital. Rome itself was watching, waiting, judging. The Senate had grown increasingly restless with reports of stalemate from what should have been a straightforward siege. Whispers in the forum questioned whether Marcellus had grown soft, whether perhaps a younger, more aggressive commander might succeed where he had failed. More dangerously, Hannibal still prowled the Italian peninsula like a wolf among sheep. Every month spent bleeding Roman strength against Syracuse's walls was a month that the Carthaginian genius could consolidate his hold on southern Italy. Every legion pinned down in Sicily was a legion that couldn't march north to defend Rome itself. The political mathematics were as brutal as any siege engine. Marcellus needed victory, and he needed it soon, or his career, and possibly his life, would end in the traditional Roman manner reserved for failed generals. "The risks," Scribonius began carefully, his scarred face reflecting decades of experience in reading the mood of desperate commanders, "extend far beyond engineering failure, Consul. If we commit the resources necessary for this creation, and it fails, we won't have enough men or materials left for a conventional siege. We would be forced to withdraw from Syracuse entirely." The centurion's words hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that every man present understood. Withdrawal from Syracuse wouldn't just mean tactical defeat. It would represent the first time in living memory that Roman engineering had been comprehensively outmatched by a foreign power. The propaganda value alone would be worth 10 legions to Carthage. Every city in the Mediterranean would suddenly believe that Rome's military supremacy was just an illusion, that their war machines could be defeated by clever Greeks with enough mathematical knowledge. Duilius, perhaps reading the doubt in his commander's expression, stepped forward with the controlled urgency of a man who had spent sleepless nights perfecting his vision. "Consul, consider what victory would mean. Not just the fall of Syracuse, but proof that Roman engineering can surpass even Archimedes himself. Every besieged city in the known world would surrender at the mere sight of our siege towers approaching their walls. We wouldn't just be conquering Syracuse, we'd be revolutionizing warfare itself." The engineer gestured toward the harbor, where the charred remains of Roman ships served as monuments to their previous failures. "For 2 years, we've played by Syracuse's rules, fighting a defensive genius on his own terms. This tower changes the game entirely. Instead of trying to overcome his machines, we make them irrelevant. His iron hand cannot reach 80 feet into the air. His burning mirrors lose their effectiveness against a structure that can fight from multiple levels simultaneously. His precisely calculated stone throws become meaningless when our soldiers can rain death down from above his own walls." Tribune Marcus Valerius, the youngest officer present and nephew to a powerful senator, cleared his throat with the nervousness of a man caught between military necessity and political calculation. "The cost, though, Duilius estimates we'll need timber equivalent to building 12 standard galleys. The bronze reinforcements alone will require melting down captured weapons from 3 cities. And the time? 8 weeks minimum for construction, probably more given the complexity. Can we afford that investment when Hannibal continues to threaten Rome itself? Marcellus studied the faces around him, reading the complex mixture of hope, fear, and ambition that drove every major military decision. These weren't just soldiers anymore. They were men whose reputations, families, and futures hung in the balance of his next words. A successful siege would make them all heroes, their names carved in marble and spoken with reverence in the forum. Failure would mean exile, disgrace, and the kind of historical footnote that cautioned future generations about the dangers of hubris. But there was something else in the tent that morning, something that had been building through 26 months of frustration and growing desperation. The Roman military machine had encountered something it had never faced before: comprehensive intellectual defeat. Not just superior numbers or better weapons, but a systematic dismantling of their tactical doctrine by a single brilliant mind. For Rome, the eternal city that had built its identity on military supremacy and engineering excellence, this represented an existential crisis that went far beyond the strategic value of Syracuse. "There's another consideration," Marcellus said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of a decision already half made. "Archimedes himself. Our spies report that he's begun construction of new defensive works, machines that surpass even what we've already witnessed. If we continue with conventional siege tactics, we're not just fighting his current innovations, but racing against his future ones. This man doesn't just defend, he evolves, adapts, improves. Every day we delay gives him another opportunity to devise some new horror that will cost us another 100 good soldiers." The consul walked to the tent's entrance, pulling back the canvas flap to gaze across the water at their seemingly impregnable target. The afternoon light painted Syracuse's walls in shades of gold and amber, beautiful and terrible in their perfect mathematical precision. Somewhere behind those walls, the greatest mind of their age was probably bent over his own diagrams and calculations, preparing new surprises for the Romans who dared challenge his city. Syracuse Harbor, October 15th, 213 BCE. The decision came 3 days later, delivered not through formal military channels but in the way that would define the character of the entire enterprise, through desperate ingenuity born from impossible circumstances. Marcellus had barely finished his morning inspection of the siege lines when a commotion erupted near the harbor's edge. Shouts echoed across the water, but not the familiar sounds of battle or drill. These were voices charged with excitement, the kind of electricity that spread through an army when fortune finally shifted in their favor. The consul abandoned his planned route and strode quickly toward the source of the disturbance, his scarlet cloak snapping in the Mediterranean breeze. At the harbor's stone quay, a small group of Roman soldiers surrounded what appeared to be a Syracusan fishing vessel. The boat sat low in the water, clearly overloaded, and its occupants, 3 men in the rough tunics of craftsmen, stood with the nervous posture of individuals who weren't entirely certain whether they had just made the smartest or most foolish decision of their lives. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcellus demanded as he approached. Centurion Lucius Septimus, a grizzled veteran whose scarred hands spoke of 20 years holding Roman shields, stepped forward with barely contained excitement. "Consul, these men claim to be engineers who worked on Archimedes' defensive systems. They've defected." The word hung in the air like morning mist over the harbor. Defection from Syracuse wasn't unheard of. The siege had created hardships that drove some civilians to seek Roman protection. But engineers? Men who had worked directly with the legendary Archimedes himself? The implications sent a ripple of anticipation through every Roman present. The eldest of the 3 Syracusans, a man whose calloused hands and ink-stained fingers marked him as someone who worked with both tools and calculations, stepped forward, with the measured dignity of a craftsman proud of his skills, despite his current circumstances. "I am Dionysios, son of Apollodorus, master carpenter and assistant to the great Archimedes in the construction of the harbor defenses. These are my colleagues, Nicomedes, specialist in bronze working and mechanical joints, and young Philoxenos, apprentice in the arts of leverage and counterweight." Marcellus studied the 3 men with the intensity of a general who had learned to read character in the space of a heartbeat. Dionysios carried himself with the quiet confidence of true expertise, while his companions showed the nervous energy of men who had crossed a line from which there could be no return. "Why have you come to us?" "Because," Dionysios replied, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that had clearly cost him sleepless nights, "we have seen what our genius has become. Archimedes was once a man who studied the movement of stars and the perfection of geometric forms. Now he spends his days devising new ways to kill Roman soldiers. The man who once calculated the circumference of the earth now calculates only the trajectory of death. The carpenter's words carried a sadness that transcended simple politics or military strategy. We came to Syracuse to learn from the greatest mind of our age. Instead, we have watched that mind turn from creation to destruction. Every morning he summons us to examine the wreckage of Roman attacks, not to mourn the dead, but to study how his machines might kill more efficiently the next time. Scribonius, who had approached during the conversation, exchanged a meaningful glance with Marcellus. Both veterans recognized the ring of truth in the man's voice, the particular kind of disillusionment that came from watching heroes become something less than human. "And what do you offer Rome?" Marcellus asked carefully. Nicomedes spoke for the first time, his voice tight with nervous energy. "We know the mechanical principles behind every defensive system currently protecting Syracuse. More importantly, we know their weaknesses. The Iron Hand, for instance, requires a specific angle of approach to function effectively. The burning mirrors need precise weather conditions and can only focus on objects within a narrow range. The stone-throwing engines have calculated arcs, if you can position your forces outside those arcs. But most importantly," Dionysios interrupted, his eyes focusing on something beyond the immediate conversation, "we have seen the plans for what Archimedes is building next. A defensive system that will make everything you've faced so far look like children's toys." The harbor fell silent except for the gentle lapping of waves against the stone quay. Even the seabirds seemed to sense the weight of the moment, circling overhead in patterns that cast moving shadows across the assembled Romans. Duilius, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the group, stepped forward with the controlled excitement of an engineer recognizing fellow craftsmen. "What kind of defensive system?" "Mobile towers," Philoxenos answered, speaking for the first time with the enthusiasm of a young apprentice eager to demonstrate his knowledge. "Towers that can move along the walls, repositioning Archimedes' war machines wherever Roman attacks concentrate. But more than that, these towers can extend outward from the walls themselves, creating artificial islands of fortification in the harbor. Imagine the Iron Hand mounted on a platform that can sail out to meet your ships, or burning mirrors that can be positioned anywhere around the city's perimeter." The young man's words struck the assembled Romans like physical blows. They had been planning to overcome Syracuse's static defenses with their revolutionary siege tower. But if Archimedes was creating mobile defensive systems, when? Marcellus asked, his voice carrying the urgency of a commander whose careful calculations had just been upended. "The first tower should be completed within 6 weeks, Dionysios replied. "Perhaps sooner, if Archimedes has solved the stabilization problems that were troubling him when we departed." Marcellus turned to Duilius, and in that exchange of glances, both men understood that their timeline had just accelerated dramatically. The race wasn't just against Roman political patience or Hannibal's Italian campaign anymore. It was against the brilliant mind of Archimedes himself, and they were already behind. "How quickly can you begin construction of the tower?" Marcellus asked. Duilius studied the defectors, then looked back at his commander with the grim smile of a man accepting an impossible challenge. "If these men can provide the technical details they claim to possess, and if we strip every available resource from the siege lines, 5 weeks, Consul. Maybe 4 if the weather holds and we work around the clock." The die was cast, not through careful deliberation or measured military planning, but through the desperate mathematics of engineers racing against each other across the narrow waters of Syracuse harbor. Roman Siege Camp, October 18th, 213 BCE. The transformation of the Roman siege camp began before dawn on the 3rd day after the defectors' arrival, and it bore no resemblance to the methodical, orderly construction projects that had defined Roman military engineering for centuries. This was something altogether different, a frantic, desperate enterprise that consumed resources, men, and sanity, with the voracious appetite of a siege engine designed by madmen. Marcellus stood atop a hastily constructed observation platform, watching his army tear itself apart and rebuild into something unprecedented. Where once neat rows of tents had housed disciplined legions, now sprawled a chaotic workshop that stretched for nearly half a mile along the Sicilian coastline. The rhythmic hammering of construction had replaced the measured cadence of military drills, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the urgency of men racing against both time and their own mortality. Duilius had divided the massive construction project into specialized sections, each overseen by the most experienced craftsmen the Roman army could provide. The timber preparation area alone required 300 men working in shifts that began before sunrise and ended long after the stars emerged over Syracuse's walls. Trees stripped from the hills around Catania arrived in endless wagon trains, their massive trunks destined to become the skeletal framework of what soldiers had begun calling simply the monster. The scale defied conventional understanding. Traditional Roman siege towers stood 40 feet tall and required perhaps 50 men to operate effectively. The monster would rise 80 feet into the Sicilian sky and demand a crew of nearly 400 soldiers, engineers, and specialists just to move it into position. Its base measured 30 feet on each side, larger than most temples, and its weight would approach that of a small warship. Dionysios had proven invaluable beyond even Duilius's optimistic expectations. The Syracusan carpenter possessed an intimate understanding of wood stress, bronze reinforcement, and the mechanical principles that would allow such a massive structure to function. But more importantly, he brought knowledge of Archimedes' defensive calculations that allowed the Roman engineers to design countermeasures into the tower's very framework. The great man's weakness, Dionysios explained to a gathering of Roman engineers on the project's fourth day, his voice carrying the complex mixture of admiration and betrayal that defined his entire situation, is his reliance on mathematical precision. His war machines function perfectly within calculated parameters, but they cannot adapt quickly to unexpected variables. The carpenter gestured toward a detailed drawing that showed the monster's proposed approach to Syracuse's walls. Archimedes has calculated the optimal defensive positions based on traditional siege equipment. His iron hand is positioned to intercept towers approaching from the northwest, where Roman attacks have concentrated. His burning mirrors are angled to focus on the standard 40-foot height range. By approaching from the northeast and attacking from 80 feet, we place ourselves outside his mathematical models. But even as the monster took shape with unprecedented speed, new challenges emerged daily that tested both Roman ingenuity and resolve. The bronze reinforcements required for the tower's joints and stress points demanded melting down captured weapons, armor, and even decorative items from conquered cities. The camp's forges burned day and night, filling the air with acrid smoke that could be smelled for miles and certainly observed by Syracusan lookouts. More troubling were the logistical nightmares that accompanied such massive construction. The tower required specialized wheels, each one carved from solid oak and reinforced with iron bands, that could support unprecedented weight while maintaining the precision necessary for accurate positioning. The internal mechanisms that would actually move the monster forward demanded craftsmen familiar with complex gear systems, pulleys, and counterweights that existed nowhere in standard Roman military equipment. Tribune Marcus Valerius had assumed responsibility for resource allocation, a task that required the diplomatic skills of a politician and the ruthlessness of a quartermaster. "We're stripping material from 12 different siege engines," he reported to Marcellus during one of their daily briefings. "The men are beginning to complain that we're dismantling our only proven equipment to build something that might not work at all." The young tribune's concerns reflected a growing tension throughout the Roman camp. Soldiers who had spent months perfecting their use of traditional siege equipment watched their catapults and ballistae disappear into the monster's ever-growing frame. Veterans who had survived dozens of campaigns found themselves assigned to construction duties that bore no resemblance to anything in their military training. But perhaps most challenging was the psychological pressure of working under Syracuse's constant observation. The city's walls offered perfect vantage points for enemy engineers to study Roman construction techniques, and there was no doubt that Archimedes himself was analyzing every detail of their progress. Soldiers working on the monster's highest sections reported seeing flashes of reflected light from the walls, almost certainly the lenses and mirrors that Archimedes used for both scientific observation and military calculation. "He's watching us," Scribonius observed during one evening briefing, his scarred face grim with the understanding of a veteran who had learned to respect his enemies. "Every day Archimedes studies our progress and adapts his defenses accordingly. We're not just racing to complete construction, we're racing against his ability to devise countermeasures." The centurion's words proved prophetic. On the project's seventh day, as the monster's framework reached 40 feet and began to resemble something that might actually threaten Syracuse's walls, the Romans received their first indication that Archimedes had indeed been paying attention. It came in the form of a new sound echoing across the harbor, the rhythmic pounding of massive construction from within Syracuse itself. Whatever defensive innovations Archimedes was creating, he had clearly accelerated his own timeline in response to Roman activities. The race that had begun with defecting engineers and desperate calculations had escalated into a frantic competition between the two greatest engineering minds of their age. Young Philoxenos, who had proven surprisingly valuable as a liaison between Roman and Syracusan engineering approaches, provided the most chilling assessment of their situation. The great Archimedes has never failed to solve a problem once he sets his mind to it, the apprentice said during one evening meeting, his voice carrying the worried respect of someone who had witnessed genius at work. If he has begun intensive construction, it means he believes he has found an answer to your tower. As October slipped toward November and the monster continued its impossible growth toward the Sicilian sky, both armies settled into the peculiar rhythm of engineers at war, a conflict fought not with swords and shields, but with mathematics, mechanics, and the kind of desperate innovation that emerged only when brilliant minds faced seemingly impossible challenges. The siege of Syracuse had become something unprecedented in military history, a battle between siege engines that had not yet been completed, fought by engineers who were making up the rules of engagement as they worked. Roman Siege Camp, November 2, 213, BCE. The monster had developed a personality of its own by the 15th day of construction, and it was not a pleasant one. The massive siege tower groaned and creaked even while stationary, its oak framework settling under stresses that no Roman engineer had ever attempted to calculate. At 65 feet and still climbing, it cast a shadow across the siege camp that moved like the finger of some enormous sundial, marking time in a race that had consumed the sanity of everyone involved. Duilius had aged a decade in 2 weeks. The chief engineer's hair had developed streaks of premature gray, and his hands, once steady enough to calibrate the most delicate catapult mechanisms, now trembled slightly from exhaustion and constant anxiety. He stood before the monster's base, studying stress calculations by lamplight while around him 400 men worked through another sleepless night. The weight distribution is becoming critical, he reported to Marcellus during their pre-dawn briefing, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the constant hammering. We're approaching the theoretical limits of what oak and bronze can support. Every additional foot we add increases the risk of catastrophic structural failure. But stopping now was unthinkable. Across the harbor, the sounds emanating from Syracuse had intensified over the past week into a symphony of construction that could be heard clearly in the Roman camp. Whatever Archimedes was building, it involved massive amounts of metal, wood, and what sounded disturbingly like the testing of powerful mechanical systems. Roman sentries reported seeing strange lights moving along Syracuse's walls at night, not the steady glow of torches but focused beams that swept the harbor methodically, as if searching for something. The psychological pressure had begun affecting the entire Roman force. Soldiers assigned to the monster's construction worked with the fevered intensity of men who understood that their lives depended on completing an impossible task before an enemy genius could devise new ways to kill them. Traditional military discipline had given way to something more desperate, the focused madness of craftsmen racing against their own mortality. Dionysios had proven indispensable, but his value came with an increasingly heavy psychological cost. The Syracusan carpenter worked 18-hour days, driven by a combination of Roman gold, professional pride, and what appeared to be genuine guilt over his betrayal of Archimedes. I taught the great man how to join bronze to oak, without weakening either material, he confessed to Duilius during one exhausted conversation. Now I use that knowledge to build the weapon that will breach his walls. The defector's expertise had solved several critical engineering problems, but it had also revealed disturbing intelligence about Archimedes' defensive preparations. According to Dionysios, the legendary mathematician had been experimenting with what he called adaptive engineering, defensive systems that could modify themselves in response to changing battlefield conditions. The great man believes that most military engineering fails because it assumes static conditions, Dionysios explained to a gathering of Roman officers. Traditional fortifications are built to withstand known types of attacks. But what if the fortification itself could change? What if walls could move, weapons could relocate, and defensive systems could adapt faster than attacking armies could respond? Young Philoxenos, who had quickly become the Romans' most valuable source of insight into Archimedes' thinking, provided even more unsettling details. Before we left Syracuse, the master was working on what he called mechanical multiplication, using gear systems and leverage to allow small forces to move massive objects. Imagine a single man operating a device that could reposition an entire section of wall or redirect the iron hand to face any direction within minutes. The implications sent chills through every Roman present. They were building the monster based on intelligence about Syracuse's current defenses, but if Archimedes was creating adaptive systems, their entire strategy might be obsolete before the tower ever reached the walls. These concerns intensified dramatically on November 5th, when Roman lookouts reported seeing something impossible moving along Syracuse's harbor walls. At first, the sentries assumed they were witnessing some kind of optical illusion caused by morning mist and distance, but as the sun rose higher and visibility improved, the truth became undeniably terrifying. Archimedes had successfully constructed his first mobile defensive tower. The structure defied conventional understanding of siege engineering. Unlike traditional defensive towers that were built into walls and remained permanently fixed, this creation moved along the fortifications on what appeared to be a sophisticated rail system. More disturbing still, it could extend outward from the wall itself, creating an artificial island of defensive capability that projected into the harbor. Marcellus himself climbed to the monster's highest completed platform to observe this new development through a captured Syracusan spyglass. What he saw there shattered his understanding of defensive warfare. The mobile tower carried multiple war machines, a smaller version of the Iron Hand, several catapults, and what appeared to be an array of the dreaded burning mirrors. But most importantly, it could position these weapons anywhere along Syracuse's perimeter, within what appeared to be mere minutes. "He's made his entire defensive system fluid," Marcellus reported grimly to his assembled officers. "Instead of having fixed positions that we can plan to overcome, Archimedes can now concentrate his defensive capabilities wherever we choose to attack. It's as if the walls themselves have become intelligent." The consul's words hung in the air like smoke from the forges, acrid and choking. Every Roman present understood the implications. Their massive siege tower, designed to overcome Syracuse's static defenses by attacking from an unexpected direction and height, had been rendered potentially useless by an enemy who could adapt his defenses faster than Roman attacks could develop. But Duilius, despite his exhaustion and growing desperation, refused to accept defeat. "Then we make the monster faster," he declared with the stubborn determination of an engineer whose life's work was being challenged. "If Archimedes can move his defenses, we make our attack so swift that he doesn't have time to adapt." The chief engineer turned to Dionysios with eyes that held both hope and madness. "You know how his rail system works. Can we design countermeasures? Ways to disable or overwhelm his mobile towers?" The Syracusan carpenter studied the distant walls through the spyglass, his face reflecting the complex emotions of a man watching his former teacher's genius used against his current allies. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "but it would require modifications to the monster that we never planned. Additional weight, specialized equipment, and—" He paused, calculation replacing emotion in his expression. "And we would need to attack multiple points simultaneously, force Archimedes to divide his mobile defenses." In that moment, staring across the harbor at a defensive innovation that threatened to revolutionize siege warfare, the Romans understood that their impossible tower had become something even more ambitious. Not just a siege engine, but the centerpiece of an entirely new form of assault that would determine whether human ingenuity could overcome mathematical genius. The race against Archimedes had escalated beyond engineering into something approaching a battle between different philosophies of warfare itself. Roman siege camp, November 12th, 213 BCE. The final week of construction transformed the monster from an engineering marvel into something that resembled a mobile fortress designed by fevered minds. Duilius had abandoned all pretense of conventional siege tower design, incorporating modifications that pushed both materials and mathematics far beyond anything attempted in the ancient world. The structure now stood 83 feet tall, 3 feet higher than originally planned, and bristled with innovations born from desperate necessity and the kind of creative madness that emerged when brilliant men faced impossible deadlines. The most dramatic addition was Dionysios's countermeasure system, a series of articulated bronze arms that could extend from the monster's upper levels to grapple with Archimedes' mobile towers. These mechanisms, based on principles the Syracusan carpenter had learned while working on the Iron Hand itself, could theoretically lock onto enemy defensive positions and prevent them from retreating along their rail systems. "We're essentially building a siege tower that can engage in mechanical combat," Duilius explained to Marcellus during one of their final briefings, his voice carrying equal measures of pride and terror at what they had created. "If Archimedes' towers can move, we make ours capable of stopping them." But the modifications had come at a crushing cost in both resources and time. The monster now required 600 men to operate effectively, nearly a quarter of Marcellus's remaining force. Worse, its weight had increased to the point where movement required not just the internal mechanical systems, but teams of oxen, elaborate pulley arrangements, and perfect coordination between dozens of specialized crews. Nicomedes, the bronze-working specialist, had proven instrumental in creating the articulated grappling systems, but his expertise came with increasingly urgent warnings about structural integrity. The bronze joints are operating at maximum stress, he reported during the project's 22nd day. One miscalculation, one unexpected force, and the entire upper section could collapse. The Syracusan engineers' concerns were validated by the monster's behavior during movement tests. Even on level ground, the massive tower swayed alarmingly, its oak framework groaning under stresses that made veteran Roman engineers pale with anxiety. The sound of the monster in motion was unlike anything they had ever heard, a symphony of creaking wood, grinding bronze, and mechanical systems operating at the very edge of catastrophic failure. Tribune Marcus Valerius had assumed responsibility for coordinating the complex logistics of what would be the most elaborate siege assault in Roman military history. The attack plan required not just the monster, but simultaneous movements by traditional siege equipment, naval forces, and diversionary assaults designed to overwhelm Archimedes' ability to coordinate his mobile defenses. "We have one opportunity," Valerius explained to the assembled centurions and engineers. "Archimedes has constructed 3 mobile towers that we can observe, but our spies suggest he may have completed as many as 5. If we attack from a single direction, he can concentrate all of his mobile defenses against us. But if we force him to divide his attention," the young tribune gestured toward a detailed map of Syracuse's harbor defenses, marked with the positions of enemy mobile towers and the proposed routes for Roman assault forces. "The monster attacks from the northeast, where his defenses are most concentrated. Simultaneously, naval forces assault the harbor walls from the south, while traditional siege towers attack the western approaches. Archimedes will have to choose which threats to prioritize." But even as the Romans finalized their assault plans, new intelligence from within Syracuse suggested that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. Philoxenos, who maintained contact with craftsmen still working within the city, reported that Archimedes had begun construction of something that defied description, a defensive system that the apprentice could only call the Great Wheel. "I cannot explain its purpose," Philoxenos admitted during one evening briefing, his young face reflecting confusion and growing fear. "It is circular, perhaps 60 feet in diameter, constructed entirely of bronze and iron. It rotates on massive bearings and contains mechanisms that I do not understand. The master works on it personally, allowing no one else to approach." The description sent chills through every Roman present. Throughout the siege, Archimedes' innovations had followed logical engineering principles, even when those principles were applied in unprecedented ways. But a 60-foot rotating wheel suggested something beyond conventional defensive systems, perhaps a weapon that could target multiple assault routes simultaneously. Dionysios, who had worked most closely with Archimedes' theoretical frameworks, provided the most unsettling interpretation. "The great man has always been fascinated by rotational mechanics, the way circular motion can be converted to linear force, how spinning systems can generate power far beyond their apparent capabilities. If he has constructed a rotating platform for his war machines." The carpenter's voice trailed off as the implications became clear. A rotating defensive platform could redirect Archimedes' most powerful weapons, the iron hand, the burning mirrors, the precision catapults, toward any point around Syracuse's perimeter within minutes. The mobile towers that had already revolutionized defensive warfare would become merely the outer ring of a defensive system centered on mechanical principles that no Roman engineer fully understood. On November 15th, as morning mist rose from the harbor and the monster stood completed like some impossible monument to human ambition, Marcellus made the decision that would determine the fate of both Syracuse and his own place in history. "We attack tomorrow at dawn," he announced to his assembled officers, his voice carrying the weight of a commander who had calculated every possible variable and found them all wanting. "Ready or not, perfect or flawed, the monster moves against Syracuse's walls. We have pushed engineering, logistics, and human endurance beyond their limits. Now we discover whether Roman determination can overcome Greek genius." The consul turned to study their creation one final time, its bronze-reinforced frame gleaming in the afternoon sun, its impossible height casting shadows that seemed to reach toward Syracuse itself. Around its base, 600 men made final preparations for an assault that would either revolutionize siege warfare or destroy the finest army Rome had ever assembled in Sicily. As the sun set over the Mediterranean on what might be their final evening, both armies settled into the peculiar tension that preceded battles where the outcome would be determined not by courage or numbers, but by the mathematical precision of machines designed by the two greatest engineering minds of their age. Tomorrow would answer the question that had driven both sides to the edge of madness, whether human ingenuity, pushed to its absolute limits, could overcome the calculated perfection of mathematical genius. The siege of Syracuse was about to become something unprecedented in military history, a battle fought between machines that represented the pinnacle of ancient engineering, operated by men who had already sacrificed everything to see their creations tested in the crucible of war. Syracuse Harbor, November 16, 213, BCE, dawn. The monster began its final journey toward Syracuse's walls in the pearl-gray light of dawn, moving across the Sicilian landscape like some impossible vision summoned from the fevered dreams of engineers. 600 Roman soldiers, engineers, and specialists coordinated its movement with the precision of a military formation that had rehearsed its own destruction. The massive siege tower lurched forward on its oak wheels, bronze joints screaming under stresses that defied every principle of ancient engineering, while its 83-foot frame swayed against the morning sky like a ship in heavy seas. Marcellus rode alongside the monster's base, his scarlet cloak snapping in the Mediterranean breeze as he watched 2 years of planning, desperation, and impossible ambition lumber toward the moment that would define his legacy. Around him, the coordinated assault unfolded with the complexity of a theatrical performance directed by madmen. Naval forces moved against Syracuse's harbor defenses from the south, their bronze rams catching the early sunlight as they raced toward positions that would force Archimedes to divide his attention. Traditional siege towers and catapult formations attacked the western approaches, creating the diversionary chaos that might prevent the great mathematician from concentrating all his defensive genius against the monster. But as the Roman assault reached Syracuse's outer defenses, it became immediately clear that Archimedes had been preparing for exactly this type of coordinated attack. The first indication came from the harbor, where Roman ships encountered something unprecedented: mobile defensive platforms that seemed to emerge from the walls themselves. Archimedes' mobile towers, rather than remaining fixed on their rail systems, had somehow detached from Syracuse's fortifications and now operated as independent floating batteries in the harbor waters. The iron hand, mounted on what appeared to be an unsinkable bronze platform, reached out across impossible distances to grasp Roman galleys and lift them entirely from the water. "The platforms are self-propelled," Tribune Valerius shouted over the cacophony of battle as he rode up to Marcellus's position. "Archimedes has created floating fortresses that can position themselves anywhere in the harbor. Our naval assault is being destroyed piecemeal." But worse news came from the western approaches, where traditional Roman siege equipment had encountered the mysterious Great Wheel that Philoxenos had described. The 60-foot rotating platform had revealed its purpose in the most terrifying way possible. It was a weapons carousel that could redirect Syracuse's most powerful defensive systems toward any point around the city's perimeter within minutes. As Roman forces concentrated their attack against what they believed were fixed defensive positions, the Great Wheel rotated to bring fresh war machines to bear, while previously engaged systems moved to new positions. Julius, operating from a platform near the monster's base, watched this mechanical ballet of destruction with the horrified fascination of an engineer witnessing innovations that surpassed his wildest imagination. "He's created a defensive system that learns," the chief engineer reported through a speaking tube that connected him to the monster's upper levels. "Archimedes isn't just responding to our attacks, he's adapting faster than we can modify our assault." The monster itself had become the focus of the most intense mechanical combat in military history. As the massive tower approached within catapult range of Syracuse's walls, 3 of Archimedes' mobile towers converged on its position, moving along their rail systems with the fluid precision of hunting predators. But Duilius had anticipated this moment, and the monster's specialized grappling systems deployed with the grinding roar of bronze mechanisms operating at maximum stress. The first contact between the monster and Archimedes' mobile defenses created sounds that no human ear had ever heard. The screaming collision of engineering principles pushed beyond all rational limits. bronze claws designed to stop ships grappled with articulated arms built to prevent retreat. Catapults fired at point-blank range into structures that had been designed to withstand exactly such bombardment. The air filled with the shriek of overstressed metal, the crack of oak beams approaching failure, and the desperate shouts of men operating machines that were killing themselves through the violence of their own operation. Dionysios, positioned on the monster's highest platform to direct the grappling systems he had designed, found himself engaged in mechanical combat with defensive innovations he had helped create. "The eastern mobile tower is attempting to disengage," he shouted down to Duilius. "But our grappling system has locked onto its rail mechanism. If we can maintain the hold." The sentence ended in a crash that shook the monster's entire frame. One of the bronze grappling arms, overstressed by forces no ancient metallurgy could withstand, snapped at its joint and tumbled toward the ground, taking with it a section of the monster's upper platform and 3 Roman soldiers who had been operating the mechanism. But the sacrifice had achieved its purpose. The eastern mobile tower, locked in mechanical combat with the monster's remaining grappling systems, could not retreat to a new defensive position. For the first time in the siege of Syracuse, one of Archimedes' innovations had been immobilized by Roman engineering. The breakthrough came not through superior design, but through the desperate mathematics of men who had calculated that they could accept catastrophic losses if those losses achieved a single, crucial objective: getting Roman soldiers onto Syracuse's walls. As the monster's upper platforms extended across the final gap between machine and fortification, Gaius Scribonius led the first assault wave onto Syracuse's battlements. The veteran centurion's scarred face reflected the grim satisfaction of a soldier who had survived 2 years of frustrated siege warfare and was finally coming to grips with an enemy he could fight with sword and shield rather than mathematical calculation. But even as Roman soldiers poured onto Syracuse's walls through the breach created by their impossible tower, the sound that rose from within the city was not the expected chaos of a successful assault. Instead, it was the rhythmic grinding of massive mechanical systems still operating according to mathematical principles that no Roman fully understood. Somewhere within Syracuse, Archimedes' great wheel continued its methodical rotation, repositioning defensive systems according to calculations that treated Roman success not as defeat, but merely as another variable to be incorporated into ever-evolving equations of war. The monster had breached Syracuse's walls, but the battle between engineering genius and human determination was far from over. In the narrow streets beyond the battlements, Roman soldiers were about to discover that Archimedes' innovations extended far beyond the harbor defenses they had spent 2 years studying. The true test of their impossible siege tower was just beginning. Syracuse, November 16th, 213 BCE, midday. The fall of Syracuse came not with the thunderous collapse of walls or the dramatic surrender of kings, but with the quiet click of bronze gears finally grinding to a halt. As Roman soldiers fought their way through the narrow streets beyond the breached battlements, the great wheel that had orchestrated the city's defense for nearly 3 hours gradually slowed its methodical rotation, its mechanical heartbeat fading like that of a dying titan. Marcellus found Archimedes in his workshop, surrounded by scrolls covered with calculations that would have challenged the gods themselves. The greatest mathematician of the age sat hunched over a bronze disk, marked with geometric patterns, his fingers tracing equations that seemed to map the trajectory of falling empires. He looked up as Roman soldiers filled his sanctuary, his eyes holding not fear but the distant sadness of a man who had calculated this moment's inevitability long before the first Roman ship appeared in Syracuse's harbor. "I was attempting to determine the precise angle at which your siege tower would achieve optimal force distribution," Archimedes said quietly, his voice carrying the same methodical precision that had terrorized Roman forces for 26 months. "A fascinating problem in applied mathematics." The old man gestured toward the geometric patterns scattered across his workshop tables. "Your engineer, Duilius, I believe, shows remarkable intuition for mechanical stress. His grappling systems violated several principles I considered immutable, most educational." Marcellus stood in the doorway, studying the mind that had transformed siege warfare from brute force into mathematical art. Around them, the sounds of Roman occupation echoed through Syracuse's streets, the organized chaos of an army claiming its prize after 2 years of frustrated ambition. But in this workshop, surrounded by innovations that had redefined the possible, the moment felt more like a conversation between scholars than the surrender of a military genius. "Your tower," Archimedes continued, returning his attention to the bronze disk, required calculations that pushed bronze and oak beyond their theoretical limits. Impressive, though I note that the Eastern grappling mechanism failed precisely when my equations predicted it would. The stress distribution was mathematically unsustainable. The mathematician's words carried no bitterness, only the professional assessment of one engineer evaluating another's work. He had spent his life studying the movement of celestial bodies and the perfection of geometric forms. In the end, the siege of Syracuse had simply become another problem in applied mathematics, one that happened to involve human lives and the fate of cities. Deulius, who had followed Marcellus into the workshop, stared at the scattered diagrams with the stunned recognition of an engineer confronting innovations that would reshape his understanding of mechanics for the rest of his life. The mobile platforms, he said slowly. The rotating weapon systems. How did you achieve the power transmission necessary for such massive movements? Archimedes smiled with the quiet satisfaction of a teacher whose most difficult lesson had finally been understood. Leverage, my dear engineer. Leverage, and the patient application of mathematical principles. Give me a place to stand, and I could move the world itself. The old man's words hung in the air like morning mist over the harbor, carrying implications that extended far beyond the immediate context of Syracuse's fall. In designing defenses that could adapt, move, and evolve, Archimedes had created something more than military innovation. He had demonstrated that human intellect, properly applied, could challenge the seemingly immutable laws of warfare itself. But as Roman soldiers secured the workshop and its precious contents, a different kind of calculation was already taking shape in Marcellus's mind. Syracuse's fall would indeed revolutionize siege warfare, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. The monster's success had proven that traditional fortifications, no matter how ingeniously designed, could be overcome by engineering audacity pushed to its absolute limits. But more importantly, Archimedes' innovations had demonstrated that the future of warfare lay not in bigger catapults or higher walls, but in the application of mathematical principles to military problems. The implications would ripple through Roman military doctrine for generations. Within decades, Roman engineers would be designing siege equipment, based on principles they had learned from studying Archimedes' captured mechanisms. The rotating platforms, mobile defensive systems, and adaptive engineering concepts would find their way into Roman fortifications across the Mediterranean, carried by officers who had witnessed impossible machines locked in mechanical combat beneath Syracuse's walls. But there was irony in this technological revolution that Archimedes himself had calculated with characteristic precision. In demonstrating that mathematical genius could challenge military supremacy, he had also proven that such genius could be overcome through sheer determination, unlimited resources, and the willingness to push engineering beyond all rational limits. The monster's success had required sacrificing traditional Roman military efficiency in favor of desperate innovation, a lesson that would echo through the declining years of the Republic. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across Syracuse's conquered streets, Marcellus stood on the city's highest tower, surveying the harbor where his impossible siege engine had finally achieved its purpose. The monster itself stood silent now, its bronze joints cooling in the Mediterranean breeze, its oak framework scarred by the violence of its own operation. Around its base, Roman engineers carefully documented every mechanism, every innovation, every principle that had made the impossible siege possible. In the harbor, workers were already beginning the process of dismantling Archimedes' mobile defensive platforms, preparing to transport the most revolutionary military innovations of the age back to Rome for study and replication. The great wheel that had coordinated Syracuse's defense would soon rotate in Roman workshops, its mechanical principles adapted to serve the expanding empire that had conquered its creator. The siege of Syracuse was ending not with the destruction of genius, but with its absorption into the vast machinery of Roman expansion. Archimedes' innovations would outlive both their creator and the city they had defended, becoming tools of the empire that had overcome them through engineering audacity that bordered on madness. In conquering Syracuse, Rome had learned that mathematical perfection could be defeated, but only by men willing to build impossibilities and operate them beyond the edge of catastrophic failure. It was a lesson that would echo through the centuries whenever human determination confronted the calculated limits of the possible. The end.